Welcome back to the second part of this series on the 1500th anniversary of Colum Cille's birth, life and legacy. Colum Cille had a passion for writing manuscripts. He was renowned as a dedicated scribe and spent much of his time writing and editing manuscripts from his wooden hut in Iona. He is credited for having personally transcribed at least 300 books, producing some of the most beautiful books in the world, books that have come to symbolise the Celts in relation to their faith. The Cathach is one of the earliest Irish manuscripts that survives to this very day, and we're delighted to welcome the first of our three contributors in this second part, Rory O'Higgin, Celtic Studies from the Dublin Institute of Advanced Studies, who will explain the significance of the Cathach and tell us of other early Donegal manuscripts associated with St. Colum Cille.
Diolch is Mr. Rory O'Higgin o Institute Ardlen Walia Clia Tás ar an Benshaw, Laustin Yulib Fui Colum Cille. My name is Rory O'Higgin. I'm from the School of Celtic Studies at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, and I'm very pleased to be here today to speak to you a little bit about Colum Cille and a project we're involved in which Colum Cille and texts associated with Colum Cille are central. Now, as one of our three patron saints, Colum Cille or Columba has long been famous throughout Ireland as he has been in Scotland, where he spent much of his missionary life on the island of Iona, known as Colmcille. The founder of many monasteries, he was revered greatly during his lifetime, and after his death, his memory was perpetuated by his followers, making him the figure he has become. As with many figures from the distant past of our history, a body of legendary lore has gathered around St. Colmcille. Some of this has been preserved in place names or in folk tradition, but more is preserved in the early writings we have that are associated with Colmcille, many of which emanated from Donegal itself. While Colum is held to be a paragon of sanctity and virtue, he also looms large in the story of Irish writing and literature. His association with literacy and learning is hugely important. Many of the foundations he is reputed to have established became great centres of learning. Some of these foundations are famous today because of their association with books written entirely or partially in their scriptoria or writing houses. The Book of Kells and the earlier Book of Durrow are widely known and admired for their exquisite design and decoration. And in Colum's own centre on Iona, it is believed that the earliest section of the Irish Annals, the foundation stone of early Irish history, the Iona Chronicle, was written. Of central importance to the story of Colum Cille are the many early manuscript sources we have that are associated with him. These are now found in many different libraries in Ireland, in Britain, and in continental Europe. But many have been captured digitally and can now be viewed online. The Irish Script on Screen initiative at the Dublin Institute for Advanced Studies, where I work, has been working in collaboration with many of these libraries for some decades now to capture and preserve the large corpus of Irish and Latin manuscripts, well in excess of 5,000 in existence, and to bring them together on a single site. This, after all, is a very significant part, not just of Ireland's heritage, but also that of Europe. Focusing on some of the material in these books that is associated with Colmcille, the following may give an idea of the wealth of written material we have from centuries back and the strides that have been taken to capture it and to present it to the wider public. Now, in focusing, the procedure involved is a lengthy and time-consuming one. It involves going to the various different libraries with a cradle and camera and slowly photographing each page, then processing it. And we remember that many of these manuscripts are centuries, well over 1,000 years old, and there are some that are in a very fragile state indeed. But this process has been going on in the Irish script on screen for the past 20 years or so. Now, in focusing on Colum Cille, pride of place must be given to the Cach, the battler, that is a psalter or book of psalms, supposedly written by the saint, even though the veracity of this attribution may nowadays be questioned. It's believed it may be a little bit later than his time. The Cach is now preserved in the library of the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin, the oldest of many manuscripts there, and will be available to be viewed on ISIS from the end of this year. In focusing on Colum Cille, pride of place must be given to the Cach, a psalter or book of psalms supposedly written by a saint, even though the veracity of this attribution may nowadays be questioned. The Cach is now preserved in the library of the Royal Irish Academy in Dublin, the oldest of the many manuscripts kept there, and will be available to be viewed on ISIS from the end of the year. It is a fragile and fragmentary document, and having it digitized will help with its preservation. According to later tradition, Colum Cille made a copy of a psalter lent to him by his teacher St. Finian. Enraged that his book had been so copied, Finian sought redress through the offices of King Diarmuid mac Carol, who judged to every cow its calf and to every book its copy. Although this early judgment established copyright, it failed to solve what became a much larger conflict between the northern peoples from whom Colum Cille hailed and their southern cousins. This led to the famous Battle of Colmcille, fought in 561 AD, where the northerners prevailed. Such was the slaughter that resulted from the conflict, according to tradition, that Colum determined to go into exile and to live his life spreading the word of God among the Picts of Scotland and further afield. The monastery he established 2 years later in Iona was to become one of the key centres of scholarly activity in the early Christian church, and the works produced there are now central to the early history of Ireland and Scotland. The Cach has a long and checkered history. An ornate book shrine was made in the late 11th century to protect the fragile vellum manuscript, and the book came into the possession of the MacRourty family of Donegal, the guardians appointed by the O'Donnells, lords of Tyrconnell. The shrine would be carried 3 times around a field of battle to ensure victory for the O'Donnells, hence it's being called the Cach, the battler. Its shrine is now in view in the National Museum. An exhibition on the Cach is currently available to view online at the Royal Irish Academy. To a relative and successor of Colum Cille, St. Adovnan or Eunan, the 9th abbot of Iona, is attributed the earliest surviving account of St. Colum Cille's life. Written in Latin before 700 AD, the Vita Columbae gives a biographical account of the saint and of the many prophecies he made and the miracles he worked. Apart from its association with Columba, it is a hugely important source for the early history of Scotland. Among many events it chronicles is an encounter Colum Cille is supposed to have had with a water monster who attacked one of his disciples who was swimming in the river Ness. In this first mention of the famous Loch Ness monster, the power of the saint subdued the creature and saved his disciple. Apart from his work as Colum Cille's hagiographer, Adovnan or Eunan is also credited with the composition of the legal text Cain Adovnan, a law promulgated in 697 AD that offered protection to women and children as non-combatants in battles. Yet another work attributed to Adamnan is De Locis Sanctis, an account of the holy places and shrines in the Holy Land. The earliest copy we have of Adamnan's life of St. Colum Cille was written before 713 AD and is now preserved in the Staatsbibliothek of Schaffhausen in Switzerland. It is believed to be brought there from Iona. How this manuscript made its way to such a location is part and parcel of the story of Irish missionary life in Europe in the period commonly referred to as the Dark Ages, and reflects on the significant contribution the Irish made to European culture at that time. From the 6th century onwards, we find many Irish monks going into exile to evangelize parts of Britain and Europe. Missionaries such as St. Virgil, St. Kilian, Gallus, Columbanus, to be distinguished from our Columba, and many others founded monasteries in different parts of Central Europe. They also came to be highly respected as teachers and scholars and were greatly valued in the courts of Carolingian Europe, Johannes Scotus Erudina being the most famous of these. These Irish missionaries and scholars brought their books with them to the ecclesiastical centres they founded, and when the Irish communities they established had ceased to function, many of the books remained and are today found in several European libraries in countries such as Switzerland, France, Germany, Italy, and Austria. The Schaffhausen text of Adamnan's Vita Columba was most likely brought there by a missionary or scholar who, like St. Colum Cille himself, had gone into exile to spread the gospel. But the presence of our text in such a location also bears testimony to the fact that the Irish missionaries who left these shores brought with them not only their books and their learning, but also the cult of their saints. And from the 8th century onwards, we have abundant evidence of Colum being venerated from Brittany to Austria and from northern Germany to Switzerland. The Schaffhausen text, if you're interested in it, can be viewed in the Virtual Manuscript Library of Switzerland. 3 further complete or fragmentary copies of the Vita Columbae, dating from the 12th to the 16th centuries, survive and are now found in the British Library. Colum Cille was also the subject of a long praise poem in Irish entitled Avra Colum Cille. Tradition has attributed this work to the poet Dalán Forgal, who flourished around the year 600 AD and would thus have been a contemporary of Colum's. Were this ascription correct, then the Avra would be the oldest extant document associated with our saint. The recent new edition and thorough evaluation of the text carried out by Dr. Jacopo Bisagni of NUI Galway suggests, however, that it may be a little bit later and date maybe to the 9th century. Surviving in a number of later manuscripts, the Avra is an extraordinary composition. Written in a deliberately obscure and archaic style, it extols the virtues and achievements of the saint. That it is seen as a high-status text can be inferred from the manner in which it is laid out in the manuscripts. It is written boldly in the script known as insular majuscule, a form of writing in which all letters are presented as capitals. Spaces are left between lines or in margins for commentary or explanatory glosses on a work that would not have been readily understood by all due to the obscure and high register form of Irish in which it was written. By the time of our earliest surviving copies of the text, the Avra had indeed attracted quite a lot of commentary and glossing, as generations of commentators and scholars sought to elucidate its meaning or to add further material associated with Colum Cille. Some of these additions are in the form of verse attributed to Colum Cille, and there is quite a lot of verse in Irish attributed to the saint, or indeed to other figures of Irish tradition. This in itself is testimony to a large body of material associated with Colum Cille being in existence in around 1100, the time of our earliest manuscript. This manuscript, or one of the earliest manuscripts, is Leabhar na Híre, or the Book of the Dun Cow, as it otherwise is known, which itself is the earliest manuscript we have that is written entirely in the Irish language. Although compiled about 1100 AD, it contains copies of many texts of a much earlier date, including not only the Avra, but the great sagas such as Táinbó Cuilne or Fled Vricran or Tugal Vridna da Djerga, and many others. The manuscript appears to have been written in the great Midlands monastery of Clonmacnoise, where, according to tradition, its vellum was obtained from a wonderful brown or dun cow that belonged to Saint Ciaran. However, it has a long association with Donegal, having been brought there probably in the course of the later part of the 12th century, and remained most likely in the possession of the hereditary historians of the O'Donnells, an office originally filled by members of the O'Skingeen family of Connacht, but which later came to the reserve of the O'Clearys. The O'Donnells of Donegal evidently attached great importance to the book. Following defeat at a battle fought in Ballyshannon in the 1350s, they were forced to yield Leabhar na Híre and another book as a ransom for the release of some of their nobles who had been taken prisoner by their enemies, the O'Connors of Sligo. The book then went into the possession of the O'Connors and remained there for the next 141 years until Rua O'Donnell stormed the O'Connor stronghold in 1470 and repossessed the book. A note written in what is a blank space in the manuscript records the event. This note would have been written after 1470. This is a prayer for Rua, son of Neil Gareth O'Donnell, who forcefully seized the book from the Connacht men, together with the Leabhar Gear, after they had been absent from us from the time of Cathal to that of Ruaidí, son of Brianog O'Connor. And 10 lords were over Caribra, that is the O'Connor lordship of Sligo, in the interval. The triumphant return of Leabhar na Híre to Donegal is highlighted in the Annals of the Four Masters, yet another Donegal compilation. The O'Donnells and their historians clearly attached an amount of importance to this book, and this can hardly be divorced from the fact that it contained a copy of our text, Avra Colum Cille, a seminal text associated with Colum Cille and his traditions. For not only was Colum a saint deeply rooted in Donegal, having been born in Gartan, but he also was a kinsman of the ruling O'Donnells, sharing a common descent with them from Conall Gollabun, the legendary 5th century son of Neil of the Nine Hostages and founder of the kingdom that was to bear his name, Sir Conall. Like the Cach, Leabhar na Híre is now housed in the library of the Royal Irish Academy and is also available to be viewed on ISOS. Following Adagnan's Vita Columbae, a mainly Irish language life of the saint, which we call Beatha Colum Cille, the first Beatha Colum Cille, was composed in the Middle Irish period, perhaps in the 11th century. Like many other early texts, however, we cannot associate an exact time or place with it, or indeed an author. It is found in the Leabhar Brak, a compilation of hagiographical and liturgical texts compiled from earliest sources and written in southeast Galway in the early 15th century. The Leabhar Brak is also housed in the Royal Irish Academy and can likewise be viewed on ISOS. Yet another early version is found in the Leabhar Clonasibne, written in 1513 on Tory Island for Máide, the wife of Mac Sibne of Fanag. The high point of Columban devotion in Donegal was reached in 1534 when Manus O'Donnell, Lord of Tirconnell, commissioned a new life of St. Colum Cille, Colum Cille the second Ba. This, by all standards, is a tour de force of Columban writing, written in the Irish of his day, not in an archaic register of the language. Manus and the compilers of this life, who set about their work at Lifford, had at their disposal an extensive Columban archive containing a vast array of texts relating to the saint. Not only did they have access to one or more versions of Avra Colum Cille and to the earlier Irish life of Colum Cille, but were able to make use of numerous poems, orally preserved anecdotes and traditions, and doubtless many other texts that were in existence in the 16th century but are now lost. It is held that the copy found in the manuscript catalogued as Rawlinson B514 and housed now in the University of Oxford's Bodleian Library belonged to Manus O'Donnell itself. This manuscript falls into two parts. The first, containing this lengthy Baha Colum Cille, is adorned by an illuminated frontispiece that you see on the screen that depicts the saint. The second part of the book is a large collection of verse, some of which is in honour of St. Colum Cille or is attributed to him. The remainder comprised a body of poetry in honour of the O'Donnell Lords of Donegal. It's been argued that this manuscript, was Manus's personal duanara or poem book, and is nothing less than a magnificent verbal art gallery of O'Donnell ancestors. The role of the O'Donnell or the O'Donnell family as patrons in propagating and promoting the memory of St. Colum Cille cannot be overstated. They attached great importance to the power of tradition, literature and learning, as befitting adherents of their great kinsman Colum Cille. The wonderful archive of texts to which Manus and his team had access had been compiled over very many centuries due to the sustained patronage and interest of the Lords of Tirconnell. It was they who underwrote the work of the historians, scribes and scholars they employed to collect, copy and redact the texts that were of importance to them. In promoting their interests, they invoked traditions associated with two great ancestral figures. One was their saint, Colum Cille. The other was the legendary founder of their kingdom, Conall Gulliban, of whom Colum Cille himself was a direct descendant. Manus's poem book in the Oxford manuscript also contains several compositions that recall the exploits and glories of Conall Gulliban. Yet another work that outlines his glorious martial career is the incomplete text known as Gawaltish Conall Gulliban, The Conquests of Conall Gulliban, a copy of which is found in a manuscript in the Royal Library of Brussels. It has been suggested that this text may possibly have been the work of a certain Maha O'Shkingin, who died in 1285, and the Annals of Lochea designate as the Olive of Kenel Conall, Kenel Conall being the territory the people we now see as Donegal, the Olive of Kenel Conall, and the Annals of Ulster accord him the rank of Ard Shanachui Éireann Ille, Ireland's chief historian, in their obituaries of him. How a copy of this text was to end up in the Brussels Library is part of another tale of Irish emigration and exile. After the fall and defeat of the Gaelic aristocracy at the hands of the Tudors and Stuarts in the early 17th century, a stream of exiles came from Ireland to the Low Countries, then part of the Catholic Spanish Empire. With them, they brought their books and their manuscripts, and many were adherents of A. O'Donnell and hailed from Donegal. Many of the books that were brought to the Low Countries, nowadays Belgium, contained material about Colum Cille, Conal Gullivan, and hagiographies or lives of saints in abundance, and other religious or devotional texts. Most of these ended up in the library, the library of the Franciscan College of St. Isidore in Louvain, a college that will be forever associated with the labours of three famous Donegal men, namely Hugh Ward, John Colgan, and perhaps the more well-known Micheál Ó Cléide, forever associated with the annals of the Four Masters. This wonderful library was later to be dispersed, some of it making its way back to Ireland via Rome, some of it remaining in Belgium in the Royal Library, and some of it, unfortunately, lost. Of the material that remains in Belgium, with the assistance of the Irish Department of Foreign Affairs, these 12 manuscripts, bearing a strong Donegal imprint, it must be said, were digitised and are now available to be viewed on ISOS. In this talk, I've tried to outline the wealth of material from much earlier times that we have associated with St. Colum Cille. And I've tried to emphasise how important the Donegal story is in Colum Cille's own story and the input of the O'Donnells and scribes and scholars from Donegal. ISOS is available to be viewed online and will have material added to it as time goes on. In the coming months, a digitised version of the Cach will be available there with a new catalogue description. And many of the texts I've spoken about today can be viewed in the original form there. And I hope people will have the opportunity to visit it and just to understand the wealth that has been transmitted to us from an earlier time. Gaum buchas lib as eishtlium agus guim radze ariarfad. Slánagi.
Our second contributor focuses on the mythology, folklore and traditions associated with St. Colmcille and the Donegal parish of Colmcille that continue to exist to this very day. We're delighted to have Dr. Joseph O'Callaghan, published author and no stranger to the discourse arena on Donegal history and culture, agus Líorthai Shasu and Julu Cheangailt, idir Colmcille agus Eirith Colmcille a tag go fáil faoi anal agus spirit and níomh umrachi seo.
Gur maithigad agus gur an fáil na fáilte ra bhilígin seo, tag General Kelleru Comoru Mila Quig in Colmcille. Welcome to everybody that's joining us and that is celebrating the 1500 anniversary of Colmcille. And I'm glad to be able to say that my own parish, my parish Jehain, Golairit Sour Ansa Luhur Ege Awanyan la Colmcille. That we have a very ancient and historical and spiritual connection in my own parish here in Colmcille with Colmcille. Arguably, probably outside his own native parish, there is no other parish with the same folklore and tradition regarding Colmcille as we have here in Colmcille, both from a geographical point of view, from place names point of view, from folklore point of view, and from artifacts that are claimed to belong to the time of Colmcille. So here's a small talk or a small lecture that I present before you. It's a work in progress and hopefully for publication in the not too distant future. So scéalta fiú de Colmcille agus Colmcille. Well, just to put it in context, Colmcille, before Colmcille's time and before St. Patrick's time, Ireland was very much a pagan culture. It's a very spiritual country, but had a pagan culture. And people often think that St. Patrick was the person that brought Christianity to Ireland. But we do know that Palladius was there before St. Patrick and that he was sent by the Pope Celestinonia to Ireland to attend to the Christians that were already here in Ireland at that time. and that we know then St. Patrick came along after Palladius, and it was he that organised the church. And often these two men are merged into the one. T.F. O'Reilly wrote an article in the 40s about the two Patricks, distinguishing these two men. So within the generation of Colum Cille, Ireland became, or within this generation, of St. Patrick, Ireland became known as the Island of Saints and Scholars, Insula Sanctorum et Doctorum. And this is what Colum Cille would have grown into, or would have emerged out of, this rich golden era of Irish monasticism and the celebration and development of many things to do with the early Christian roots of Ireland: manuscripts, cells, the beehive huts, chalices and round towers and such things. So this is the period of which Colum Cille emerged out of, and who we come to celebrate today. The question then, who was Colum Cille? Well, first and foremost, he was a saint. And with that comes a whole spiritual and religious element. He was a priest, a prophet, a poet, a scribe, a scholar, a missionary, a man of the arts, and also a Gael, a person that loved all things to do with the Irish language, Irish culture. And he was one of the 12 apostles of Ireland. St. Colum Cille of Iona, who had attended in Clonard, St. Finnan's in Clonard. And so this is where Colum Cille emerged out of, and we know the whole history and stories about Colum Cille being born in 521, some say 520, in Gartan, here in Donegal. And not far away from that, his native parish, is my own parish, Cloughanneely. It's a stone's throw down the road. And we do know that there are 3 Latin lives of Colum Cille that survive, that tell us very much many historical, some of it legend, some of it myth, stories about Colum Cille. And very few people up until Middle Ages would have had so much written about them, or so much information that survives. And there's no doubt, there's more information about Colum Cille probably than most saints in Ireland from that period. So I'm going to come in now to my own area and the Bellages Atchul, the local folklore. And again, Bellages is something that grows within the community. Some of it may be true, some of it's exaggerated. And stories, as you know, as they're told, they develop and they grow and they change. So this is the story of Cloughanneely and Colum Cille. And there's where we are located, up in the northwest of Donegal, Torry being the outer island close that Colum Cille allegedly went to. And Sean O'Haughey writing one time said, "Lie away and is many castle rad gorta horkia, and Cyrus Nord Francis a hugum, agus in a ye tamil koru a yanu lum, or she kishtorum, or casu Colum Cille revort." He asked him, did you ever meet Colum Cille, this Franciscan monk that had been in Torry? And he went on to say that he was in Torry and that he met Colum Cille. And Sean O'Haughey was stunned with this question. And then he understood eventually what he was saying. He was talking about the spirit of Colum Cille. And then he says, Higma Kajavi Nenchin and Sayard. He understood what was in the priest's mind, that this was about the spiritual aspect of Colum Cille. And I have no doubt that anybody should ever come to my parish, they will experience that same spirit even 1,500 years later. And again, the Koshkiman and the footprints of Colum Cille are to be seen in our geography, in our place names, in the folklore, in the literature, in the pishraga, in the spiritual practices, and even in modern times, in buildings, the name of buildings, and in the architecture of some of our modern buildings, that Colum Cille is still very evident today. And maybe one of the nicest places to find out original stories from folklore is in duhas.ie, the folklore collection, Ballian the Skull, in 1937. And I've gone through most of these stories in my own native parish, and many stories are in it on Colum Cille. And if we look, for example, if you write in Colum Cille and press search, there are 219 stories in this folklore collection from Donegal about Colum Cille alone. And if you write it in Latin Columba, there's another 41 from Donegal. So there are a terrible lot of stories about Colum Cille or Columba in the folklore collection, which clearly lets us know how important he was right up into the 1937 and arguably even up into our present day, that he's still very much present in our folklore, in our mind. And this is one beautiful piece of this collection by Nan Doherty. She interviewed a woman from Torry, and she gave quite an extensive a description of Colmcille's connection with the area. Again, I hope to publish all this in the not too distant future. But that woman's father, Anthony O'Doherty, wrote a beautiful poem. There's 4 or 5 very long poems he wrote, but one of them about Cloughanneely and Colmcille. Bhavini Colmcille chartas ag Palu, Frijan Cantor Gohella, their Ellen agus a cheer war. He says often Colmcille was coming to the area and bringing other saints with him. And he goes on to explain how there was Begley and there was Feenan, and there was Dewey, 3 other saints as well, these early saints that are connected with the folklore of our parish. And that's just a one to commemorate Anthony O'Doherty in our local parish church in Gardahork. But Mickey McGowan in Rohamora Thiel, probably a very well-known book, talks about him being hired out at the fair. He obviously went to Letterkenny and then was hired out to a family in Garton, not far from where Colmcille was born. And he puts it down in his book, Viachna go mai tu nyan vaha, as os rodena rona ma gasser go foil, hanentas a bee, go mula and cooey corner. So he talked about how loneliness would have hit him as a young boy. He probably was about 11 or 12, and he was out in hiring, out in around Glenveigh, and he went to Lachnacooey to lie down so that the Lachnacooey would take away his loneliness. That's what he was hoping. And he said that it worked to a certain degree. And then that's the cross that Cordelia Adair built that's beside that in 1911. And that's where he lay. And there's often many people from this parish, when they were leaving to emigrate, would go to Garton and to lie on the Lachnacooey, the stone of loneliness, before they left, hoping that sickness of loneliness wouldn't follow them when they would go abroad. But Maguire, writing his History of the Diocese of Defoe, says aptly and rightly, the footprints of the early saints are indelibly impressed on almost every hill and vale and island of the streamlet belonging to this expansive and historic parish. And he talks about Crocknaneve, the hill of the saints that stands in Marote. I just live at the bottom of it. And he talked about how 4 of the apologetic pioneers of the gospel assembled there about 540. And among those was Colmcille. And there's a long folklore story that tells about Crocknaneve and how they were wanting to partition the parish between them and how they would go. And Manus Donald puts it down beautifully in the manuscript in 1532. She had Colmcille, Riv, Erson, and Tui Torry. So he was told to go to Torry. Agus Hanig and Tangle again, and an angel came to him, agus dur Dalcogin Island Darvanium Torra, to go to the island called Torry. Now, this is the Old Irish from 1532. And it's clear from what he wrote down that the other saints that were there in Crocknaneve also wanted to go to Torry. So they decided that the best way to resolve the matter was supposedly to throw their staffs. And so each of them were to throw their staffs, and wherever their croziers would land, then that would be the island or land that they would have to set up their monasteries. And all the other 3 threw their staffs and didn't land in Torry. And each of them said, Lema Kodju Hain agus Kodju J, with my help and God's help. But when it came to Colmcille's turn, he changed it about and he says, Le Kodju J agus Mo Kodjusa. He put God first, with God's help and my help, it'll land in Torry. And so that's what he did. And supposedly it landed out in Torry, and that's where he went and established his monastery. And there's a lovely version of this story, it's be too long for today, told by E.O. Dewey in 1931. It's a lovely old recording about the 3 saints on the way to Torry. And it's well worth listening to it. It's on the Donegan website. And there's Crocknaneve, there's our Father Shan, celebrating Mass on Crocknaneve. There's an altar there and a nice high cross. So Seamus O'Sharkey, who came from Critch Island and would have been the president of College Jollu, Buchton College Jollu here in Gardahork, wrote a book about Baha Colmcille, and he talks about how strong the Belliges tradition in my area, in Cloughanneely, was with regards to Colmcille, and also how Manus Donald made numerous references to his time, particularly in Torry Island. And there's another wonderful book that has never been actually put into English, but Ono Colum, I remember him well, and he has quite a depth of information about Colmcille and Torry in his book Torry na Dun. And he estimates that it was Colmcille that took the Christianity to Torry, but that he wouldn't have stayed there very long. And many of the things in Torry that's attributed to Colmcille, he argues, like the club chat, the round tower and stuff like that there, that a lot of that may not necessarily relate to Colmcille as such. And there's a beautiful survey done in the 1853 Ulster Journal of Archaeology by Edmund Getty on the Christian period in Torry. And there's a picture I'm showing you of the old tower. The island would be different now in structure, building-wise, to what it was. Even that's 1853. It has changed that much since then. And there you see the old monastery where the pier is now. You'd be landing. You can still see some of it here in this picture, and you see the round tower behind it, and you see the Tow Cross, which is still there. There's many stories about how Colmcille landed on the island and the different folklore things as to what happened and how he banished those that weren't of Christian origin and so forth. Again, too much for here for today. But it's believed that he spent time in Torry. And in fact, when Sir Derek Hill was wanting to gift the people of Torry a present for their kindness to him when he went there to paint, he got a beautiful wonder made by Patrick Poland, and it's in the church. That's it there, Colmcille sailing on his boat, heading to Torry, and it's still there in Torry to be seen in it. A testament of the connection with Colmcille, Torry, and the folklore. And again, that's in my own hand. That's the Kalish Colmcille, would be believed to be the chalice of Colmcille. It's a stone metal weight. It's very, very heavy, and one could insert your fingers into the side of it and use it as a chalice, and is believed to go back to Colmcille's time. And in fact, it was there until 1890s when it was taken off the island, and it's now in the diocesan archives. But it was believed that when one would drink from it, particularly women that were pregnant, that there was a cure in it, and it would give them ease and give them a safe and healthy birth. That's what was believed, that was the gift that Colmcille had left for the people of Torry when they couldn't get a priest or a doctor, according to folklore, that they could use this chalice. And again, there's numerous things written about it. For example, this report by J.B. Bale in 1898, describing the size of the chalice and how it is hollowed out of a small iron stone about 3 inches in length by 2.5 inches in diameter. There are 5 finger holes in the sides of the base. So this is still an artifact going back to that time. And again, there's plenty folklore stories about Colmcille and this chalice and the early monks that were with him on the island. One thing that we're not sure of, and it's mentioned in Manos O'Donnell, is a glacú. That's just a picture I have there, but the glacú was a pillow, a stone pillow that Colmcille allegedly used in Torry, and then it was upon this he put it on his knee and that he would sleep, and that the stone was there up in the time of Manos O'Donnell, 1532, but as of now, we don't know what's happened to it or where it went. But that was the glacú. And then there was another famous artifact in Torry where we don't know where it is. It's believed, and I've done some research on it, that it was removed and taken because it was seen as idolatry. It was because it belonged to the Catholic tradition and was taken during the time of the penal laws. But the cross allegedly was one that Pope Gregory had, and that he had sent it to Iona to Colmcille, and that Colmcille then later transferred that back to Torry Island. And Manos O'Donnell gives a good account of the famous cross and the story about how Colmcille received the cross and received the people, the messengers that the Pope had sent to him in Iona. And if we look at the last line here, it was that he asked that it would go to Colmcille asked that it would be sent to Torry and kept there for the people. Again, there's no trace of this cross today, but it's in the folklore. And everybody knows the Craigarten, Garten clay. Well, in Torry, there's something equivalent to the Craigarten, and that's Urhorry. The Ur is an Irish word specifically for clay, but it's holy clay that was in Torry. It's still there, and we believe, and the islanders believe, that this soil will prevent you from drowning, and it also banishes rats and vermin. And the story goes, again, that more Hisher means actually 7. Shisher today means 6, but the more Shisher was the 7. And the idea, according to the folklore, was that there were 7 children washed, and there were both young men and young women, sorry, not children, young men and young women were washed in a boat, and that they were dead. And it is believed that they had come they were children of the King of India, if one is to believe the folklore. It's to be found in Torri na Dun and also in the Folklore Commission and also in Manos O'Donnell. And that they were, Colum Cille realised what had happened, and he decided they would be buried in a grave together. But when they woke up the next morning, the girl, one daughter, it was 6 boys and 1 girl, the body came to the surface and they buried her again. And the following day she rose again. And so Colum Cille said, this girl is a saint, she needs to be buried on her own. And she was buried on her own in this grave. There's a picture of it. And they built a little altar around it. And it is from there that the Torri clay is taken. And it's believed that it prevents drowning and stops rats. And there's a big demand for it still to this day here locally. But you must ask for it. The Gallery agus Colum Cille, you must ask for it for God and on behalf of Colum Cille if you're to get it. And it's the Dugan, one of the Dugans that must lift this clay, the oldest member of that family, because it was the Dugans that first gave an invitation or allowed Colum Cille to come onto the island and allow him to establish his monastic establishment there. So that's the belief with that there, and it's still very much in demand. Now, there's a beautiful interview from 1956 Princess O'Colin did with Willie O'Dugan on that there. It's on the web if should someone want to watch it and listen to it. And it puts down about the Torri clay. Now, in Clonheely, there are numerous wells. There's actually 4 wells in the parish ascribed to Colum Cille. One in Torri, which is no longer there, was filled in because a young boy drowned many, many years ago, and they filled it in because of that. One that eroded in Inishbofinian due to erosion from the sea. And then there's 2 still there, Tubber and Ardivig, and Father Shan, our parish priest, still has prayers there in the rosary after Mass on the Feast of Colum Cille every year, and that's him there. With my own little boy, and we'd have the privilege every year, apart from COVID last year, of going there, and the whole parish comes out and prays the rosary and commemorates celebrates Colum Cille. And there's another one in Derryreel. There's another beautiful Colum Cille well in Derryreel. That's it there, not far from Muckish Mountain, a beautiful well, very much untouched. And actually, Colum Cille's handprint is allegedly, you can see it, but it's alleged to be the hand of Colum Cille. So there are many aspects of that as well. And people use that water as holy water. It is believed the Ardsbeg water was used to make butter in the time people would have been churning, and it was very good for that. And then there's a famous, allegedly the highest Celtic cross in Ireland or in England. And there's quite a bit of information emerging lately. Dr. Brian Lacey has done a lot of research on this cross, and we don't know if it dates from Colum Cille's time or not. But what we do know is it's called Cross War Colum Cille, and folklore, and is believed that it was there because it was to go to Torri Island. That's the monastery there from the air, and it's inside that the cross now stands. It fell sometime about 1750, and it lay there until it was erected by the Board of Works back about maybe 60 or 70 years ago. And whether it was directly related to Colum Cille or not, historically, it certainly is with the folklore. And there's lots and lots of folklore of how it came to be there. And the story goes that as Colum Cille was getting the cross made and carved out of Muckish Mountain and carried down, that he left it with St. Finan in Rye. But when he was there, he realised that his breviary he left it behind, and he asked that one of them would go up and get his breviary, and if they could find it, he would grant any wish. And so Finan arrived back down, supposedly with the breviary intact. A bird had spread her wings out over the breviary to keep it dry, and when it came back intact, he gave it to Colum Cille. Colum Cille was delighted, and the story goes that Colum Cille says, well, what wish do you want? He says, well, I want you to leave the cross there. And the cross still stands in that very church to this day. And it's very, very like the cross of St. John and Iona, very similar. Obviously, the cross of St. John is much more decorated than the plain one that's in Rye, but very, very similar. And one would wonder, again, has Colum Cille anything to do with the fact that he was on Iona, and this cross is almost similar in height and in shape? Just something to consider. But further to that, there's also other folklore stories that tell us about Colum Cille with Asfinan. It's not a well, but a waterfall, and it is believed that Colum Cille one day could see from Torry that one of his monks was very thirsty, and that was supposedly Asfinan, and that he touched the rock like Moses 3 times, and out of the rock came water, and it was that water then that was able to alleviate St. Finan's thirst. And so to this day, there's a great belief in the water of Asfinan, but the tradition of these terraces or these trips, these religious trips, were frowned upon from the 1850s onwards because they were seen as places for faction fighting and maybe drunkenness, and such gatherings weren't being very spiritually beneficial, and so they were suppressed. It did revive again somewhat with our parish priest, in former times, Father Dennis Quinn, and tried numerous times. He tried to have on good days that he would go there in August, usually the 15th of August, to go to Tubber or Asfinan, sorry, and do the little pilgrimage. And there's an elaborate process to do this, and that's it there. And you can see the water. That's myself standing below, and you see the water scooting out of it, and that's known as Asfinan. And O'Donovan visited this Asfinan in 1835, the man that was doing the translation of the Irish place names, and he played a little pun with it. I thought it was very, very nice. As meaning waterfall, the waterfall of Finan. But in English, it meant something else. Dear sir, I visited the celebrated Ass of St. Finan yesterday after having finished my Turras, meaning trip, Turas, he says. I drank the sacred rill and descended and winding stairs to see what had happened to O'Connor, and lo, I found him stretched in the grass with his eyes closed, he fearing to remain on his feet. Mr. Thomas O'Connor, said I, why don't you wash off your sins by the Ass of St. Finan? So, playing upon with the word ass as an Asfinan, but it is something that is still believed very much, very alive in our community, to be a blessed and holy place. And again, O'Donovan in 1835 talked about how quarreling families used to collect their factions and fight there, and many other abuses were committed to the great displeasure of both St. Finan and the modern clergy who have abolished the Turris. So that explains why it wouldn't be as alive now in our culture as it would have been before that time. And Colum Cille, we talk about his legacy, and one of his legacies was to affect someone like Arthur Kingsley Porter, who owned Glenveigh, and he came to Ireland to write a book about high crosses of Ireland. And while he was doing that, beginning that research, he heard about Colum Cille, and this amazed him, this man Colum Cille. And it was Colum Cille that brought him to Donegal, and he stayed in Marble Hill. And while he was there, then he found Glenveigh was for sale, and he bought Glenveigh. And he later then went and built a house out on Inishboffin Island. And he was very, very taken by Colum Cille. And we know in 1933 he disappeared. We don't know whether it was drowned or whether it was suicide or whether actually some believe that he disappeared to live another life. One doesn't know. But what we do know was at that time, between Glenveigh and Inishboffin, he wrote a drama, Colum Cille Goes. And the drama wasn't actually published until some years after his death by his wife, Lucy. And it's a very, very accurate account of Colum Cille's life. An excellent and wonderful little production, and was part of a book of three dramas put together. But there's something very interesting in it. And I wonder, some people here think that Kingsley Porter disappeared and went to live another life, that he didn't actually die, or he didn't have a heart attack, or he didn't commit suicide. And if one reads the drama, there's a few verses that make for very interesting reading. Colum Cille's Cargill there at the shore, will carry him soon where we'll see him no more. He'll be gone, and at the morrow's dawn, we'll find him wandering, lonely and lorn. And the boat will spread its wings of white, and grow smaller and drop from sight. And those who stand on Erin's land will weep and wait and wave their hands. The tides will rise and the tides will slack, but Colum Cille will never come back. As the rivers flow, the ages will go, and many a boat must sail just so. And I just wonder, was he talking about himself? And many a boat must sail just so. But again, Colum Cille obviously had captured Kingsley Porter's mind and heart and his knowledge. And then just one other small thing, quite often, we'll often hear throughout the county, but particularly here in our parish, there's different places where there's footprints and handprints, and they're alleged to have been the footprint or the handprint, in this case of Colum Cille. And this is on Maharoti, not far from Crockton and Eve, that this is allegedly the footprint of Colum Cille in our local folklore. Here, I'm coming to the end, I'm conscious of time, and there's no doubt, as Sean O'Hoy, this is a bit from Sean O'Hoy's folklore collection, he talked about how many people, famous people, that have gone, their story is told. But with Colum Cille, not only is his story told, but his legacy is still very much alive, particularly, he says, in the Gaeltacht areas that he has travelled during his time here in Donegal. And I have no doubt that what he's saying there is still evident today. And that Colum Cille, Riv agus Lorga lava go fada leachne, niwen agus an Albin a comai. So his legacy is very much still to be seen. And again, this comes to the word traditio. In Latin, traditio means tradition, to hand on. And we're celebrating 1,500 years of Colum Cille. And it's clear even today how alive he still is in our folklore, in our place names, in our geography, in our islands. The fact that we're commemorating and celebrating here today his life story. And we have been given this by generations. And we are now handing it on to the next generation. And the question is, what are we handing on? We mustn't forget that this man was a saint. And what drove him was his love for the church, for Jesus Christ, because he was fundamentally a person, an early apostle, a man that was very much driven by the motive to spread the gospel. And that was what he was about. Everything he did was to spread the gospel and to work with bringing what's so-called the kingdom of God to his world that he lived in at that time. And so the challenge isn't just to commemorate Colum Cille. The challenge is also to every one of us is to try to say, well, what can we take from this man's great legacy and hand on to the next generation? And I must commend all the different groups and peoples and organizations that are trying to hand on something of that valuable tradition that we, the people of, particularly of Cloughanneely and Garton and neighbouring parishes, can be so proud of. So, Goromaigiv, I'm seeing I'm hitting at 30 minutes. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope also that this will be published at some stage as a book. I'm nearly finished with it. And that I'll try to make it bilingual for people so that they can see both the Irish and the English. Goromaigiv, Slán agus Banad, agus bain solt as an ceadú míle cuig céad bliana. Goromaigiv.
And casting the net further afield, our third contributor, the Reverend David Holton, rector of Garton, who himself was raised in a church dedicated to St. Columba near the banks of the Humber estuary, will present on the Columban movement spread throughout the British Isles and tell about St. Colum Cille and his undisputed role in spreading the beliefs and creeds of Christianity beyond Scotland and into Northern England.
Well, thank you, Porrick, for inviting me and introducing me to speak about Colum Cille's legacy. My name is Reverend David Holton, and I'm the rector of Garton, the parish where Colum Cille was born and where his family and his birthplace are. As you can probably hear, I was not born and raised in Donegal, but I was raised aware of Colum Cille's legacy in Britain, and I learned more in Germany. And from this slide, you can probably see that I was not always a rector, if you see my qualifications. Before God called me to be a rector, I worked as a chemical engineer, studied, did research, and then worked for different firms, including in Germany. This is the church in which I was brought up from the age of 8, that I attended every week. It's St. Columba's Church in the parish of Drypool. And it's important that Drypool is the last parish on the north side of the Humber estuary. We're in the northeast of England. North and Humber will come back in this talk a bit later on. It's the church I went to for many years till I went off to study chemical engineering. And it's the church in which my younger brother Martin still worships God to this day. In St. Columba's Church, the pulpit is made of stone, and you can see inset in the middle of it a plaque made declaring Iona, and that's made from stone from the island of Iona to remember the legacy we have from St. Columba, as he is called in England and in most countries. It's from the Latin, of course, for Colmcille. And we heard about Columba bringing the good news of Jesus Christ and God's love to Britain all those hundreds of years ago. And I've also heard previously about the Celtic monks who brought the good news of Jesus Christ to the pagan English and further afield, much further afield. But you might wonder, didn't St. Patrick come from Britain to bring the good news of Jesus to Ireland? Well, there'd been a problem. Between Patrick leaving Britain and Columba's death in 597, pagan Anglo-Saxon peoples from Germany, Denmark, and southern Sweden had invaded Britain and conquered Britons across much of what is now England and some of Scotland. And on this map, you can see Kent down in the south, the Saxon kingdoms, the Angles here, Mercians, and then the Northumbrians, named after the River Humber, because that area, that kingdom, is north of the River Humber, where my church was, where I was brought up. The kingdom of Northumbria went extended right up into what was Scotland, and that probably got the attention of the monks in Iona. The year Columba died, 597, the Pope had sent a missionary to Kent, right down there in the south, because the King of Kent had married Bertha, who was, I think, from what's now Belgium, and she was from a Christian family. And so the king accepted a missionary to start a church in a place called Canterbury, and he began to evangelize the pagan people of Kent, the Saxons, and so on. He had slow but steady success in the south, and some kings also converted. But there was a lot less success in the north. Although, as you can see on this map, Northumbria was a very large kingdom, but more sparsely populated. In the south, here's Drypool on the River Humber, which is a mile-wide estuary. Here's York, and up here is the royal castle of Bamborough. The pagan English kings, particularly in Northumbria, had strongly opposed the preaching of this new religion under St. Augustine and the first missionary bishop sent from Iona too. It was said that he was quite a hard disciplinarian and didn't go down well with the people. So St. Aidan was sent instead. He was a much more gentle and mellow character who set about getting to know the people, loving and caring for them, as well as proclaiming the gospel of Jesus and how God loves us. And he was invited to do this by the new king, King Oswald had been educated in Iona, and he had a Christian belief, a strong Christian belief. And so he keenly supported this mission to have his people knowing God in their lives. In fact, he was so keen that King Oswald would go with Aidan and the monks on their missions to visit villages and farms in order to translate the message into the local tongue. On this slide, you can see the holy island of Lindisfarne, the priory and a statue of St. Aidan. And just along the coast there on the right, this is the castle at Bamburgh, a royal castle. This is the latest rebuild. It wasn't like that, just like that back 1400 years ago. But it was a very important castle and had been for centuries before that. So we've talked about the Irish monk, St. Aidan, who came from Connaught, I believe, and had been sent from Iona to Northumbria and begun the evangelization of the pagan Northern English in the early 600s. From him, or through him, you can see a list of other saints who also carried on the work of Columba. St. Wilfrid and St. Willibrod and St. Boniface. St. Wilfrid set up monasteries across the north of England, and he had been educated in Lindisfarne, so he was the first of these who was actually English. He was a Northumbrian English man, and he set up monasteries. One of the most important is Ripon. And if you go to Ripon, you can still go into the original oratory where he and his brother monks would meet to pray. The whole big cathedral, built only 800 years ago, is over the top, but it's still there. You can go down the stairs under the transepts. And one of those monks with him was St. Willibrod, born, you can see, about 20 years after Wilfrid. And he was also from Northumbria, an Englishman, also very keen to spread the good news and to bless people. And we need to remember this at this point, that the English were originally Germans and Danish, and so their relatives of not long ago were still living on the continent. And Willibrod determined he would take the good news to the pagan parts of Holland. So he went to Frisia, which is the eastern side and northern side of what's now Holland, and became appointed by the Pope the first Bishop of Utrecht. And later on, before he died, he went to what's now Luxembourg and established Echternach Abbey. And that was done as a joint project between Irish and English Celtic monks. And he is actually now one of the patron saints of Luxembourg. Following on from him came St. Boniface, and he was again born about 20 years later. And he was from the West Saxon area called Wessex. He was also a monk. He was, like Columba, he was from a royal family, and he had a missionary heart, and he was asked the Pope to let him go to try to reach out beyond Holland and Luxembourg back to the German heartlands. So he went first of all to visit Willibrod in Frisia, and from there he went to what were called the Franks and the Saxons, related of course to the English. He became Archbishop of Mainz and was given all Germany as his diocese, even though there were hardly any churches to the east of the River Rhine. But when you go there, and I've lived and worked and loved Germany, when you go to Salzburg in Austria, you see a plaque in the cathedral saying how this was established by Boniface and the brothers. Or Regensburg in Bavaria, same. Würzburg, which is in Franconia, or Erfurt in Thuringia, which is right on the eastern side of Germany and was in the Soviet region under the Soviet Union. He spread the gospel a lot. So just to show what happened, on this map, you can just see the edge of what's England, that's East Anglia. And this is a map of Europe. Denmark was up the top. And France now, this is 1,000 years ago or so, France roughly is this area here, and then down through the half of Burgundy, down to Provence. Italy, of course, you can see, that's more or less unchanged. The Low Countries of Belgium, Luxembourg, and Holland, where are this area here, where Frisia is, and you can see here's Utrecht, where Willibrord was the bishop, and Frisia, which he converted much of, and Luxembourg round here, Estenach, and you see this red dot. And from there, you see the purple dots. This is Mainz, further to the east, where Saint Boniface was made archbishop by the Pope when not many people were Christians to the east. And he went to Fulda, up in the mountains, a lovely place, and his friend Stormy, sounds like a German maybe, he became the abbot of a new established monastery there. And Boniface said that when he died, he would like to be buried back at Fulda. But then he went to Regensburg, right over here, and then Salzburg, down in what's now Austria, and also up to Erfurt, which is right on the border then, or with the Slavonic parts of Europe, like Czechoslovakia and Poland and so on. This was a huge undertaking, all done within 1 or 2 generations. At the same time, of course, there had been other Irish missions, and Irish monks and hermits went off across Europe. Famously, St. Gallus, down in what's now Switzerland, on the edge of that lake, and Paderborn in the north, where I actually worked at one time, and the cathedral there is, one of its patron saints is St. Bridget of Kildare. There was a huge impact of the Celtic monks and nuns across the north of Europe. Interestingly, Boniface, like Columba, being of royal blood, was also a little bit impetuous, shall we say, and over-assertive. And it is said that he was very dismayed by the means of outreach of some of the Irish monks. And I think he would have come to regret, because of the great effect that so many Irish monks had, that he was trying to be such a disciplinarian, and maybe like Aidan's predecessor also didn't go down as well as he could if he'd been kinder and more gentle like the monks were. Now, this is all part of my story. It's not just something I've read in books. So the church I was brought up from the age of 8, St. Columba's. When I really came and God spoke to me as an adult, and I made an adult commitment to give my life to him and follow him at the age of 19, was at a place called Eschborn. This is the church there in Eschborn. And it was a Lutheran church near Mainz, and a great place which really helped me in my spiritual life. When I was studying more recently, having been called from being a chemical engineer to become a rector, I studied in a good university, and then I also did some time here. This is Erfurt, and this is the cathedral, the Dom, as they call it in German, and this is another church right next to it, dedicated to St. Severus. And just on this side, down here to the side, is the Catholic seminary where people are trained, men are trained to be priests and others to be theologians. And this is a picture of me when I was still a student of theology over there, explaining the finer points of the Church of Ireland and Church of England Eucharist to people who were studying for the Catholic priesthood. When I was a vicar, the first place I was a vicar was in a place called Gargrave, not Gartan, but Gargrave. And this is the church. The building, the tower, was built in 1521, so exactly 1,000 years after the birth of Columba. And there's quite a lot of Celtic crosses in the graveyard, but also when the rest of the church was rebuilt in the 1800s, they found pieces of the Celtic crosses in the foundations, and these would have been erected by the monks who came to preach the gospel, to give mass, to bless the people, and to teach them how to have good lives over 1,000 years previously, before a church was built. Because like here, at that time, churches were built, when they were built of wood, and the first stone church probably was built in about 1100, when the Normans had invaded, and the next vector was of Norman blood. And from there, of course, I've now become appointed as a vector of Gartan, and behind me and here on the screen you can see the old church in Gartan, remembering St Columba, where Colmcille lived so many years ago, in what's now probably the graveyard where the old abbey originally was. Life can sometimes go back, and I feel part of that movement forward from here, and are so honoured to be back here. So in summary, Colmcille was not a plaster saint who did nothing wrong, who was always virtuous. He was a man of royal blood who did seriously wrong things. And there are all sorts of myths built up around his life and mission. But there is reality there. He was a real human being, through God's grace and love, forgiven for what he did, determined to do some good with his life, with a huge legacy, primarily, of course, to Scotland, but then to the rest of Britain and across the north of Europe. He wasn't perfect, just like we aren't, but he responded to the love of Jesus Christ and his grace given to us because he died for our sins. And God was with Colmcille in his mission, and it inspired many others to go on to bring many into the love of God's kingdom on earth.
And our final pair of contributors is drawn from the arts. St Colmcille has been the subject of inspiration for poets, musicians and playwrights for centuries. But in modern times, recent artists include Seamus Heaney, Liam Lawton and Brian Friel. And here to perform selected excerpts from Brian Friel's play titled The Enemy Within, an imaginative account of the voluntary exile of St Colmcille. Tá luchar áireann go bhfuil nóil ó Gallagher linn. Scríbneoir agus drámadóir é nóil ag go bhfuil go leor gradam náisiúnta bunte aige sa scríbneoireacht agus sa drámaíocht le blianta boganús.
Sna sleachta seo as aistan a grama Brian Friel, The Enemy Within, lórum Colmcille le duine d'Agmani a lanaí. Agus an sin lóran sé go géir le na dhéar arán a tá né a háart a séirin a géirí ar gáil na bháile le 5 eile réite agus iad a chráirú chun cathe. Fuair léirús na písaí seo ar Colmcille, an duine príomhaide, an níu a bhí cáil a híal a seirbhis dé thar a an fear nar a ga anam nach rí a hir úis a riamh.
A muosa chibhran ar bailbog, bhí carmag a buint, agus mis sin a dhé a cruniú, mé crum go talú, agus teas na gréine idir a déil in anagum. Agus what is a teoch ar na? Ar fai bommate When my jaram at glan, grow mar jory art and shaw elani. Honnegas du, gurs a wallet your honnelivi ma. Gus a mate harmwick, gur on mo yerar, if ye gunless spille, agus a porter art o hen. Alve, model somebody be taffam. Crinnig foesig bonno parke, agus rart hjolig the fushaga, sa spe garum lanas mo hjom. Dan ma krum got halu, agus vi stuek jal en jaragil mo hul. Nur han jad la bonno parke, de kalmuk skartjes in, et boisha crew hopwil. Bent hewer in recession, bent hewer in. A dan mis je krommer vi ma. Mor nu kalmuk vi daarom, a on mo jerai. Vi kreeg artan fi mo chasse, agus monomor iski log artan mo chluase. Agus me dula mo wahai ekelj, bo mo je bi, wolan chrik, ik ginsje doen groot trek bij reigi doen. Loor karmok long. Am loor heen had de maard sherry. Chi jiesje had jokkelum wat er heen egalj. Chi jiesje de hernen had jokkelum yet a egalj. Tes hogum. Hoog ma oplushi. Hoog ma skalta. Hoog ma monestra. At he far. Cyfrihe ystyn siom o ler, a wyl a chri agos a anam, frewi hag a dot dangen, e gyr las wanga na heram.
Ai gwbrod y hir chonig a chalyn i niw, ik mosgwys ma calig a chaid ysgwntw. Ta cléir in a gastí go gairt an éisrial. Ó chailtíh a gondaig go frasis go fial. Ta'n pobl go crafai garni sa lean. Sgan fasgun a scahan fin godagian. Ta'n sairj boi codis and tafran y rai. Altar gan skjewel rof gan sky. Liw colum gan awdys colum an hein. Rogwr yn lygsio te kirchig liain. Mag mi satna ysl chal. Sliart chael wod agos niel na niel. Ba fi an y fe goni garnin ar sgriw. Ta chais na mriatre naig fallen na niw. E shinim na sam le luachio na nin. Na I garnu na sashgal na waister laf hein. Be cofnier y lai sios na bliante le hart. In gwtran yn amsyn sy'n mei fwyn y smart. Sni greit nes di smolly, sni rai yn mwy. Brawd ban I chef lan cholyn is new Colum Cille.
Niel me gal, ni higlum, niel me gal love. Jack aram a yerai, Jack aram. Ta mai giri shananish. Fecinn se muid scíhain, agus iad crúdaí le cruthe cogaí. Agus is tíon seo tá crí a lémún go tiú, agus a bhfuilm go teang, nuair a hiigin lei, agus sibh geirí ar mo leh le sibh cheorú a gaith agus a góraic. Tá anam a gom fásta. Anam bag suar a matcha at a gyn siadú go jar ma fáiliom. Is gyrraid yr isgymyd at a hasw as cord a chrwyhara o'r session. Na diglad na bianti jar na had o da hilach a hawr wahe lomsa. Agus dei o hort o fiant an a colna. Emigi, bigi hiwl. Gyrradig I lefa mohas ma wanishtir. Hiw lefa mohas ma elan. A mohas mawak. A mohas ma heel. Chegi rasht. Hag na cric lamont sin. Agus na sleif jo molly sin. A hannig at ma hen agus mo ia. Des tu mo hod olish. Yul tu mo hod falle. Rid tu mo hod faralarte. An hod a baird am o heel. Gydje elle at a yard wom a in lamonte. Manum. Damnu. Damnu. Damnu ort a erin. Erin. Ere chwyn los. Ere elin los. Mo ched siac. Ere. Mo hirin uwish hen.
car